Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I appreciate you all so much, and I really am so delighted you enjoy these stories as much as I do. And of course we're on part 4 of our story. It's a very exciting story. Little Edward is going to stay in Canada with his grandfather. He hasn't seen his grandfather since he was 5 years old. He knows that there is a demon living inside his mother, which is why his mother has been behaving him so very badly. This demon was conjured up after someone who claimed to be a witch had come around to the house to cast a kind of spell in order to make his mother fall pregnant, because she was desperate to have lots of children, and so she ended up having twins. But ever since that spell was cast, his mother is not the same person. And so little Edward has been neglected, not being fed properly by his mother, and so now he's going to stay in Canada with his grandfather. So we're about to see what happens next, but before we do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with part 4 of our story tonight. Later that night, Edward found himself seated on the passenger side seat of his father's car. He was still wearing his pyjamas. His father drove all the way to Canada, from their home in Michigan. The journey to the Blue Mountains, where Edward's grandfather lived, was about 8 hours away. They left Michigan at midnight, after Julia Barry had protested with great indignance about Wayne taking her son to stay with his father. "But you can't just take him off to Canada like that," she said furiously. "Edward belongs here with me and the twins." "I'm taking him to my father's in the Blue Mountains. Until you get your act together, Julia. You need to see a doctor, love. You're not yourself these days. Maybe you're suffering from postnatal depression or anxiety, who knows? The doctor will know exactly what to prescribe for you." "I am most sure about that. I don't know why I didn't see this before. You've been so angry and reactive these days. But now I completely understand. You're not coping, love, with the demands of raising our children. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Plenty of women in your position find raising kids to be very challenging, and I do know the twins are demanding. We need help in this house of ours, because you're not managing. Mrs. Weinstein believes you are suffering from postnatal depression, because it would explain your behaviour of late." Julia Barry's nostrils flared. She gritted her teeth together furiously, glaring at her husband with an expression of such hatred that Edward couldn't even bear to look at her face. What on earth was wrong with his mother? He asked himself, knowing, of course, full well what was going on with her. There was a demon living inside her. He'd seen its face often enough. "How dare you say I'm not managing?" Julia had screamed, the outrage very discernible in her voice. Julia Barry began to indiscriminately throw things around the house, so there were breakages from china and pottery that were now lying in dead carcasses across the living room floor. But Wayne Barry paid them no heed. Little Edward had seen for a brief moment his mother's face morph into that demonic entity again. When Wayne Barry was out of hearing distance, Edward's mother's voice changed, becoming deep and gravelly. She looked straight at Edward, with devilishly menacious eyes that were not her own, but were as black as licorice. "What are you staring at, little Edward? Happy you're going away from here, are you? I can get you wherever you go." At that his mother burst into cackling laughter that had scared the bejesus out of little Edward, who had never heard his mother's voice change like that before. It was exactly the same voice that he had heard coming out of Zara Witchen months before. Edward knew that it was not his mother who had addressed him, but the demon that had possessed her and was living inside of her. Edward was secretly rather glad to be getting away from his mother, as that thing that had taken over her body was getting progressively stronger and stronger by the day, and slowly and surely taking over everything. Only rarely these days did he get glimpses of the mother he once knew and loved. But she was in there somewhere, but being smothered by this demonic entity. Edward was sure his father had absolutely no clue as to what was really going on with his wife Julia. Over the last few months he had physically distanced himself from his wife. Wayne Barry could hardly bear to look at her. There was something about his wife that had put him on edge. In the old days he had loved the bones of her, but since she had fallen pregnant with the twins, and even after they were born, his wife had changed beyond recognition. If it wasn't for his children, Wayne Barry would have filed for divorce without even blinking an eyelash, for he was not happy in his relationship anymore, and he hadn't understood why Julia's own family seemed to refuse to want to speak to her these days, along with her two best friends, for she had turned everyone against her, including even her own dentist. Now his son Edward was the latest victim of her incompetent negligence. Wayne Barry ignored his wife's shenanigans as she continued to throw things around the house. He helped little Edward pack a suitcase, and before Edward had known it, he was being swept away by his father in his dad's car to visit a grandfather he had never met. Well, had met, but had no memory of. Wayne Barry was expecting to arrive at his father's cabin at some time after 8 or so, depending of course on how good the roads were and how many stops they had to make along the way. Edward slept most of the trip, and when he finally opened his eyes, he was staring out at the most glorious views and shimmering golden sunrise that had spread magnanimously across the somewhat demure powder blue sky in a cheerful golden glow. Edward wound down the window eagerly and gasped at the beauty that surrounded him, as craggy rocks and glorious mountains slashed their sculptural resplendence proudly across the horizon, and were so incredibly majestic they literally took Edward's breath away. "Grandpa Otter lives around here?" he asked wondrously. "It's so pretty." "You like it, son?" "Yes, it's lovely." "Well, he does live here. This is the Blue Mountains," his father told him. "We are now in Canada. This is a famous ski destination, would you believe? In this part of the world there are lots of stunning waterfalls, rainforests, limestone caves. And you see those craggy rocks over there in the distance? Well, they're known as the Three Sisters. You're really going to enjoy staying with your grandfather," Wayne Barry assured his son. Before long, Edward's father's silver Alfa Romeo rattled down the long dirt road, surrounded by thick brush and lovely, luxurious wood groves of tall, lofty trees. Soon the car drew up to a small wooden cabin that looked like an old miner's cabin. The door of the cabin suddenly swung abruptly open. Edward's grandfather, Otter Barry, was standing outside the cabin door on his wraparound porch. He was looking straight at them, dressed rather casually, wearing a bucket hat on his head, along with a brightly coloured shirt covered in salmon pink and orange flamingos, as well as a pair of blue denim shorts that were faded, and a pair of boots on his feet. Edward was not sure how old his grandfather was, because the broad smile across his face, along with his perfect set of pearly white teeth, which were obviously his own, made him look significantly younger than his real years. But the telltale lines on his face, the crow's feet around his hazel green eyes, and the deep olive colour of his complexion, that was heavily bronzed from spending a copious amount of time out of doors, suggested he was older than he first appeared. Otter Barry had a day-old shadow across his chin, which gave him a somewhat rugged appearance, probably because he hadn't shaved for a day or so. Before Edward Barry could blink his eyes, his grandfather had quickly hurried over to the Alfa Romeo, in a spirit of delighted enthusiasm, for he was eager to see his son and his grandson. Seconds later they were embracing, and Edward was certain he could see misty condensation gathering in Otter Barry's eyes, which suggested he was holding back tears, and was so pleased to see the both of them. "It's very good to see you, son. Very good indeed. It's been far too long, and I've really missed you. Why, I think it's been 5 years, has it not?" "It's sure been a long time, Dad. And we really haven't got an excuse, have we? I mean, we only live 8 hours away from you. We should have got together far sooner. Never mind, son. You're here now, and that's what counts." "Ah, so this must be little Edward," said Otter, embracing his grandson with a warm hug. "Goodness gracious me, you have grown up, young man. You've grown into quite a big boy now. Come in, the both of you. You must both be so very thirsty after your long trip. And we have a lot of catching up to do, have we not? I want to hear all your news." It was over beers and a few snacks that Edward's father and Grandpa Otter were caught up together in deep conversation. Edward realised that his father was telling Grandpa Otter all about his mother Julia and her strange unorthodox behaviours that were causing him grave concern.
"Oh dear me, son. I'm very sorry to hear all that. You say Julia's completely changed after the twins were born. Could she possibly be suffering from postnatal depression, I wonder? I understand it's very common in women after they've given birth. I dare say your poor wife has had her hands full raising the twins. It couldn't have been easy for her." "I'm not sure it is postnatal depression, Dad. Julia started exhibiting these bizarre behaviours even before the twins were born. I feel as if I've been married to a stranger all this time. I'm doing my best to ignore her as often as I can, because I don't enjoy being in her company anymore. I can't continue to live like this. It's insufferable. I feel very uncomfortable in my wife's presence. We're always at each other's throats these days. I feel as if I don't know her anymore. But you loved her once, son, and she was very good for you. I don't know, Dad. Something's seriously wrong with her. Sometimes I look at her and I cannot recognize the woman I married. This version of my wife I do not like. There are moments I'm afraid to return home. As I keep saying, we fight like cat and dog all the time. There are days when her eyes grow so insidiously dark that they scare me half to death. Almost as if it's not my wife who's in my presence, but someone else, as strange as that may sound." "Good Lord, son, that does sound ominous. I never imagined you'd ever talk about the love of your life in such a dismissive way like this. Things must be very bad for you. When I got your phone call last night, I was flabbergasted. You sounded so... what's the word?" said Otter Barry, rubbing the rough shadow on his chin. "I think disquieted is probably an apt word to use. That's exactly why I'm here, Dad. Julia has been ignoring Edward's most intrinsic needs. A neighbour, would you believe it, found him eating cat pellets out of the bin. That's how hungry he was. She took him into her house to give him a slap-up meal. She'd noticed for quite some time that Edward was looking unusually thin. You see, she's a secretary for the headmistress at the school that Edward attends. She lifts him to school all the time, so she's noticed him becoming thin. She was furious that Julia had been failing to feed our son. She actually threatened to go to social services and report my wife for child neglect. I begged her not to do it, but she said if Edward lost any more weight, she'd be forced to do the unthinkable. Let's just say if social services get involved in our lives, they could decide that Julia is an unfit mother and put Edward into foster care, and I cannot allow that to happen, Dad, under any circumstances."
Otter Barry's eyes widened.
"This does not sound like the Julia I know," he said.
He sounded completely confounded.
"That woman has always wanted to be a mother. More than anything else in the world. It was all she could ever talk about. I remember she told me once she wanted to have a litter of children. So for her to uncharacteristically abandon her children like this is shameful, to say the very least. But I'm sure there is an innocent explanation for all of this. Don't you worry about Edward, son. I'll put some meat on those bones of his for you. You go back home and speak to your wife. Find out what really is going on with her. Maybe she can shed some light on why she's been so disconnected towards little Edward. I think it would be wise for you to take Julia to see a doctor, to see what's going on with her. Maybe you should hire a nanny or an au pair to help her with the twins. Maybe she feels as if she's been swallowed alive, and she simply can't cope. Some people can become incredibly overwhelmed by responsibility. Their personalities can dramatically change. They can become cantankerous, cranky, and exceedingly unpleasant to be around. If it makes you feel any better, son, let's just say after you were born, your mother had her less than glamorous moments, when she got quite riled up at times. I realized, of course, that she was exhausted, being awoken at all hours of the night to attend to your needs. You were a demanding baby, crying all the time, and of course the colic you had only made things a whole lot worse."
"Good Lord," said Wayne Barry, looking quite disturbed by this revelation.
"I had no idea that I was a nightmare as a baby. Mum never told me about that. Well, you know your mother. She wouldn't want to upset you. But if you want to know the truth, you were hard work, son. But your mother wouldn't have changed anything for the world. You were the apple of her eye as you are mine. All I'm saying is your mother only had you. So I'm not sure how she'd have coped with twins if they'd both been as demanding as you were. So don't be too hard on your wife. As I was saying, maybe she's bitten off more than she can chew. She's not as young as she was when she first had little Edward. She's probably a little overwhelmed by being a mother again, especially of twins. Well, maybe you're right, Dad. I'll have to go back home and see what's going on with her. I'm sure, son, if you hire an au pair to help around the place, things will get significantly better for you. And when you've sorted things out at home, you can come back here and pick up little Edward. Thanks, Dad. I really appreciate it, said Wayne Barry gratefully. Any time, son. Any time.
Edward had stood in the doorway next to his grandfather, watching his father drive away in his Alfa Romeo, until his car was all but a dot on the horizon. Grandpa Otter turned around to smile warmly at his grandson.
Well, it's good to see you, Edward, after so many years. You've grown up into a fine young man. You and I are going to have the time of our lives out here. I'm very appreciative of your company. So tell me, what do you think of Canada?
Edward glanced out at the prepossessing view that stretched out before him and said, It's very beautiful, Grandpa Otter. The views here are really lovely.
Why do you think I moved to this part of the world in the first place, son? Let me tell you, when your grandmother died, I was completely lost. I came here because I knew the natural world would heal my broken heart, give my life a sense of purpose, so to speak. Of course, it doesn't mean I don't miss your grandmother terribly. Indeed, I think of her every day. But out here in the wilderness, I do feel, well, let's just say not quite so alone, if you know what I mean.
But you are alone, Grandpa Otter, Edward was quick to point out.
Well, in a manner of speaking, you're right, Edward. But out here with the natural world surrounding me, the indigenous wildlife, all the fauna and flora, well, I don't feel quite so alone.
Edward Barry had been rather reticent towards staying with Grandpa Otter, but his grandfather had made him feel so warmly welcome. Together they had gone fishing, hiking, hunting and exploring together. Edward was enjoying himself at the cabin, so much so that he didn't want to leave. It would seem that time was going by very quickly. Grandpa Otter was larger than life, with a colourful personality, which was why he wore the brightest, most colourful shirts to complement his gregarious character. It seemed to Edward strange that someone with such a hearty sense of humour, like Grandpa Otter so clearly had, that he enjoyed living out in the wilderness all on his own. Grandpa Otter had taken Edward to the local town, and everywhere they went people had stopped to speak to Grandpa Otter, for he was well liked by the local community, and everybody was equally as delighted to meet little Edward and to welcome him to Canada. Edward could not help but think that Grandpa Otter's bright, cheerful Hawaiian shirts clashed with the scenery, and were so dramatic you'd likely spot him a mile away. Grandpa Otter told Edward lots of stories about his late grandmother, and every time he mentioned her, his face would light up like a Christmas tree. Edward felt decidedly sorry for his grandfather, because he'd lost his wife, and he wondered what it would have been like to have known his grandmother. Grandpa Otter really was an excellent cook, and he made the most delicious hearty stews that Edward had ever tasted. There was now a healthy glow to his complexion, and his clothes no longer hung off him in rags. Edward was glad to be away from his mother, but he thought about her often enough, wondering if the demon that resided inside her was getting worse or not. He really believed that if Zara Witchen had not visited their house that fateful day, to call up that entity to help his mother become pregnant, that he would still have the mother he loved in his life, but now she had become a different person altogether. One day after Edward had spent the afternoon fishing at the stream with Grandpa Otter and catching several decent-sized rainbow trout, which had been cooked on a griddle for dinner and served with butter and garlic, so it melted on the tongue. "Well," said Grandpa Otter, rubbing his stomach, "that was very good fish, was it not? But I hate to say this, Edward, you look dead beat. You're very tired, I can see. It's the mountain air, it does it to you.
It can make you sleep like a baby. I think you better retire to bed. You can barely keep those young eyes of yours open. I think I'll turn in myself for the night. It's been a long day, but a productive one at that, given how many rainbow trout we caught at the stream."
"Good night, Grandpa Otter," Edward had said, giving his grandfather a big warm hug. "Next time we go fishing at the stream, Grandpa, I'm going to catch a bigger rainbow trout than you."
"Well, we'll see about that, little Edward," said Grandpa Otter, smiling at his grandson warmly.
Edward returned to the spare room in the cabin, where no sooner had he brushed his teeth and put on his pyjamas, he was out like a light. He was no longer being harassed by hunger pangs that would in the past keep him wide awake late into the night. It was later during the night that Edward woke up with a start, as the bed he was sleeping in began to rock and shake violently, and then there at the end of his bed was a demon. He recognized the demonic face, the face he'd seen on his mother from time to time, the face of the thing that lived inside her. For a moment Edward was absolutely certain he must be dreaming, but when he rubbed his eyes again and again and blinked, the demonic entity was still there. It was grey, 10 foot tall, with gargantuan proportions, and such a grotesque face with bulging eyes and horns on its head. It gave Edward a huge menacious grin, showing off a full set of razor-sharp teeth, and then it said,
"I told you you couldn't get away from me. I've come to get you."
Edward stared at this hideously vile thing that had fully manifested before him in abject horror. His mouth dropped open wide like a Venus flytrap, for he had never beheld anything in his life this grotesquely evil. The thing that had been living inside his mother was now after him, and had made that clear. It had come all the way to the Blue Mountains in Canada, as if distance for it was of no significance at all. Before Edward could do anything, the beast was now on top of him, thrusting him down forcefully onto the bed. His big hands were around Edward's neck, and he began to squeeze and squeeze. Edward was gasping for breath as he tried to shake this monstrous beast off him, but the creature was so huge and so powerful that Edward just could not stand up to him. He could feel the oxygen being sucked out of his lungs, and he was sure he was about to die.
"You're mine," came the deep guttural voice. "You're mine."
For a second the demon let go of its tight stranglehold over Edward, and in that brief moment Edward let out a loud, ear-piercing scream that caused the entire cabin to rock. Indeed, he screamed so loudly that his grandfather came rushing into the bedroom to see what was going on. Edward's screams had shaken the entire cabin and thrust Otter Barry out of a deep, contented sleep.
"What is it, Edward? Are you having a nightmare, son? It's nothing to worry about. I've had them before myself."
Edward continued to shake like a leaf. He didn't answer his grandfather, but pointed to the corner of the room, his eyes so wide with terror, his body quivering like a blancmange jelly.
"It's over there! It's over there!"
he said, tears spilling down his cheeks.
"It was living in my mother. Now it wants to live in me."
Edward continued to shake, pointing again to the corner of the room, where Otter Barry focused his attention, and suddenly he saw a dark mist swirling around and around, and he could smell the repugnant stench of death and decay that seemed to have stolen away the room's fresh air.
"What the hell is that?"
said Otter Barry, staring in bemusement at the swirling mist that began to take shape. The demon once again manifested itself, this time before Grandpa Otter, who began to make the sign of the cross and pray the Lord's Prayer, demanding the demon to leave at once in the name of Jesus. The demon hissed at Grandpa Otter, grinning menaciously, but then disappeared in a wisp of smoky vapour. And then a loud wind manifested itself in the cabin. The curtains billowed, everything shook violently, and then the demonic entity was gone, leaving behind the most pungent scent that did not appear to abate. Grandpa Otter was naturally concerned about what had just transpired. He looked unduly disquieted, for he had seen the demon with his own naked eyes. It was over hot, steaming mugs of cocoa that Edward told his grandfather about the witch, who called herself Zara Witchen, who had visited their kitchen one sunny afternoon, and how she had performed rituals with his mother and 2 friends, and how they'd sat around the kitchen table in the darkness with 7 lighted candles, chanting incantations and calling up a demon called Mammon, in order for his mother to fall pregnant.
What on earth was your mother thinking, inviting the strange woman into her house that is heavily involved in the occult? You don't mess with things like that, said Grandpa Otter disapprovingly. Your mother is an intelligent woman. Doesn't she realize if you play with fire, you're going to get burnt?
But she wasn't playing with fire, Grandpa Otter. They lit candles, that's all, and then they performed rituals and cast spells so that my mother could fall pregnant. But they didn't play with any fire. Not that I saw, anyway.
I wasn't meaning that, son. When I say your mother was playing with fire, what I'm saying is she was very foolish to do what she did. What happened next? I need you to tell me everything. Otherwise, I won't be able to help you fix this problem. The demon has been in our cabin. We got rid of it for the moment, but it's likely to come back. It seems to be after you, son, for some reason. So everything you can tell me, son, will be enormously helpful.
Mammy wanted to get pregnant, as I was saying. But the witch called Zara Witchen, who came to the house, told Mum that they had to call up Mammon, and Mammon would make her pregnant. And it worked. I could see the demon was in the witch, but now that same demon lives in my mother. That's why she became so horrible.
Well, it certainly explains a lot. Don't panic, son. The thing that possessed your mother will not possess you. I won't allow that to happen. We are going to sort this out once and for all. I have a plan. I know someone who may be able to help us. I will call him over to the cabin this evening. He will know exactly what needs to be done.
That evening, Edward and his grandfather were standing together on the wraparound porch. Grandpa Otter began to whistle 3 times, and then he let out 2 owl hoots that sounded like the real thing, and Edward sensed he was calling someone, but who, he couldn't imagine. It was cool outside the cabin, with the cold mountain air whipping against their faces, punnelling their clothes ever so slightly. Edward shivered because it was a tad cold, but Grandpa Otter didn't appear to notice the temperature at all. He was still wearing his flamingo shirt, with the short sleeves, and goose pumps had broken out on his arms. The full moon lit the night sky with a generous light, serenaded by hundreds and thousands of glittering stars. Everything was serenely quiet, apart from, of course, the trills of the crickets and frogs, along with the distant hoot of the occasional owl. Just when Edward was sure that nobody was coming, or no one had responded to his grandfather's call, he suddenly noticed a discernible movement in the trees, as branches began to shake rather vigorously, and then an ambiguous, shadowy, tall, lofty form began to glide towards them. Edward could not comprehend exactly what he was seeing. The thing that moved towards them was a human being, but not exactly human, more like a giant-sized man that was completely covered in dark flowing hair. Edward had never seen a human being that looked like this before, but Grandpa Otter was to tell him later the creature was known as a wild man or a Bigfoot. Moments later the wild man was standing on the wraparound porch, and then Edward had to peer right up at him because he was so tall, possibly 9 foot, and had the biggest, most ponderous shoulders and feet that Edward had ever seen. He wore a leather necklace around his neck. There was a pendant attached to the necklace, along with 3 eagle's feathers. He wore a matching band on his hairy arm. The wild man spoke in a strange language that Edward could not understand, but his grandfather appeared to understand everything he was saying. The wild man nodded his head as he was speaking to Grandpa Otter. Then he said something, and then Grandpa Otter nodded his head in return and invited the wild man into the cabin. The wild man was so incredibly tall, he had to bend his head and position his body at a specific angle to crawl into the cabin, which made Edward giggle. It was then that Grandpa Otter turned to Edward.
My friend tells me the demon in our cabin is called Mammon, the spirit of gluttony. He said he could feel the demon's presence from miles away, all the way back in the woods. He said he saw the dark energy swaddling our entire cabin."
Edward stood in the bedroom next to his grandfather as the wild man finally entered the room. He pointed to the corner of the room where the demon had manifested itself the previous night. Once again the Bigfoot spoke some solemn words to Otter Barry, and Otter told his grandson exactly what his friend had told him.
"My friend here is telling me that the demon is here in the room, over in that same corner we saw him in earlier. But he's not physically manifested, for he's trying to hide in plain sight. He knew I was inviting my friend over, and he knows he's going to be thrown out of this cabin and back to the depths of hell from whence he came. My friend here says that the demon was invited to help your mother, I believe, fall pregnant, and in exchange for her pregnancy, in having 2 babies, he wanted to possess your soul, Edward. But your mother told him to possess her instead, for she wanted no harm to come upon you, which is why your mother has been behaving so strangely since the twins were born, and even before that, because she has been possessed by Mammon. He is a very greedy spirit. That's why he's the spirit of gluttony. He can never have enough to satisfy his unquenchable appetite, and possessing your mother was not enough. In time, he hoped to possess your whole family, especially you. He came to the cabin to possess you, while he is still possessing your mother, for he can be in multiple places at once when needs must. But he didn't know when he came here that his powers would be challenged."
Edward watched as the wild man's voice boomed. He ordered the demon to reveal himself. All of a sudden the demon did just that, manifesting itself before Edward, his grandfather, and the wildman. Edward began to shake like a leaf when the demon revealed himself again, but the wild man appeared not to be intimidated by it at all, which brought Edward a measure of calm, especially when he realized the wild man seemed to know exactly what he was doing, and seemed to have some kind of authority over the demon. Gone was the look of self-satisfied smugness on the demon's face, for his grotesquely evil face shuddered as the Bigfoot pointed a finger at one of the walls in Edward's room. All of a sudden, Edward's room began to change dramatically. Everything went into black and white dots, rather like a television when it's on the blink. Edward couldn't comprehend why the demon was suddenly beginning to scream, and then he saw the wall was swirling, like ripples in a large body of water, and in the centre of the wall appeared a long tunnel. It was like the wild man had suddenly opened up a portal into another world or realm. A purple mist developed. It swirled around and around in circles, projecting a powerful magnetic force, which caused even Edward's bed and the dresser in his bedroom to rattle precariously. Edward could feel a windy current emanating from the portal, and it beat obtrusively against his face. The demon's eyes went from a dark, menacing black colour to a fiery, indignant red. He roared objectionably at the wild man, who kept chanting a mantra that was making him more and more incensed, almost as if the wild man was throwing holy water at him that was physically burning him. This disgusting, grotesque, repugnant vision of depravity cried out in pain every time the wild man spoke a single word. It was almost as if every word the wild man uttered was like a burning red coal being flung directly at the demon's face. Soon the tortuous pain of the wild man's words became all too much, and the demon's resistance appeared to crumble, almost as if it was admitting defeat. The wild man began to point directly at the portal. He said some more powerful words that made the tunnel in the wall become larger and larger, like a great big opening jaw that was very much alive and was throbbing and pulsating, and seemed eager to swallow the demon whole. Edward and his grandfather were holding onto the bedpost with all their might and strength to anchor their weight to the floor, as the whole bedroom had become like a gateway to another world or realm. And then it happened very suddenly. A loud suction sound, like a powerful industrial hoover, entered the room, and then the demon, screaming loudly, was sucked down the long vortex like a dead, discarded insect. The opening to the portal bulged as it sucked the demon down the long tunnel with a whizzing sound. The wall to Edward's room began to change. It became like a TV on the blink, giving Edward the distinct impression that the wall in his bedroom was not completely solid. But as suddenly and as dramatically as things had changed, they returned quickly to normal, and everything went quiet and serene again, and there was peace in the cabin. This time the wild man turned around to talk to Edward, who wondered why he was talking directly to him, for he knew he would be unlikely to understand a single word that the wild man uttered. But when the wild man spoke to him, the words seemed to enter his head and change into English, like a direct translation code.
I have sent the demon Mammon back to the bowels of hell, to where he belongs. He can no longer harm you, young man. Your mother, you will be glad to know, has also been relieved of her possession. Mammon no longer has any legal hold over her or over you. I have made your family forget about this unfortunate event. I have sent a veil of forgetfulness to all those that have been touched by Mammon's disruptive behaviour, that has caused much damage in its wake, for some things are just best not remembered. I don't know how to thank you for all of this, said Otter Barry. I knew you would be able to help me, like you helped me when I arrived here in Canada, when you told me my wife was watching over me. I was so broken up in those days, so desperately broken up, so completely lost. But you told me that my wife was watching over me. You told me that my wife was near. And you knew things about her that nobody could possibly have known, because you have the ability to tap into the unseen worlds. And since I met you, I've had my life given back to me. But now you've done more than that. You've given my son back his wife. You've delivered my grandson Edward from this demonic stronghold that was about to overcome him. How can I ever repay you? It was necessary to intervene, said the wild man. I could see the darkness swaddling your cabin, and I knew that demon needed to be dealt with. I did what was necessary.
The wild man was looking at Edward now, his dark eyes filled with a genuine concern, an obvious kindness.
I will not take away your memory, young man, of what happened here, for you must teach others not to mess with what they do not understand.
The wild man patted Grandpa Otter on his back with an affectionate familiarity and said,
By the way, talking about if you want to pay me back in kind, well, some of that peanut butter you give me on occasion, that would be very nice. Consider it done, my friend, said Otter Barry, breaking out into a laugh. He knew all too well the wild man's weakness towards peanut butter. Soon Edward and his grandfather were watching the wild man leave the cabin and retreating into the heart of the woods. It was only years later that Edward would realize that his grandfather's special friend was known as a Bigfoot. Edward spent one more carefree, very relaxing week with his beloved grandfather in his cabin, until both his mother and father came to collect him. In his father's Alfa Romeo, there was no hint in his parents' demeanour to ever suggest that they had ever been at loggerheads with each other. Instead, they looked like the loving, devoted couple that they had always been before the twins were born. It really was like going back in time, before Zara Witchen had come to the Barry household, and everything had gone badly awry. It was almost as if none of those things had ever transpired, as if those horrifying events had been washed away with a power hose, to be remembered no more. And what could be better than that? Edward's mother ran towards him, embracing him warmly with a big effusive hug. "Oh, it's so good to see you, darling. We've missed you so much, your father and I. And so have the twins. They've missed their big brother, that's for sure. How did you enjoy your break with your Grandpa Otter? We knew sending you away would be a great opportunity for you to get to know your grandfather better." Edward looked at his mother for any trace of the ugly thing that had resided inside her, but he realized with great delight it was long gone. He had his beloved mother back,
I had a lovely time, Mum. A great time. We went fishing and exploring and hunting, he said, grinning from ear to ear. It was the best time ever. Finally, when he did say his goodbyes to Grandpa Otter, his grandfather whispered in his ear,
I'm going to miss you, little Edward. It's been a pleasure having you to stay with me. You know you can come to the cabin to stay here with me any time you like. You're always welcome. But you must remember your parents won't remember a single thing about the discord that erupted between the two of them, due to that demon that possessed your mother. The wild man thought it was for the best that they should forget everything, so he wiped their memories clean, which I think is a good thing. Only you and I will know about it, what really happened. But let's keep it that way, shall we?
Yes, Grandpa Otter. I won't say a single thing, said Edward in a quiet voice.
Good boy,
said Grandpa Otter, slapping him affectionately on the back.
Make sure you come and see me soon, Edward.
Edward nodded, thanking his grandfather for an unforgettable holiday that he knew he would never ever forget. By all accounts, the wild man had promised his parents would have no memory of the event that had caused so much chaos in their lives, so life did indeed continue as normal, almost as if there had been no disruption, no hiccups along the way. It would seem Wayne Barry seemed to idolize his wife more than ever, and was constantly saying that he was the luckiest man in the entire world to have married Julia Barry. Edward grew very fond of the twins, who were no longer screaming the house down, but grew up to be calm and very well-behaved little children. Edward became very close to them, and was a very protective older brother. The long and the short of this rather extraordinary story is that Edward ended up having a very contented, happy and fulfilled childhood, but he never did forget the demon that Zara Witchen had called up into the kitchen on that inauspicious day, a demon who had demanded Edward's very soul in exchange for his mother being pregnant, a price that Julia Barry was simply not prepared to pay. So instead she agreed to give up her soul instead, for there is no greater love than that of a mother. The demon Mammon was the spirit of greed, and he had brought so much havoc into the Barry household, robbing the Barrys of their loving relationship, and Edward's mother of her nurturing spirit. But that was now all thankfully in the past, and things had happily returned to normal again, and Edward couldn't have asked for anything more than that. It would seem even his neighbour, Alice Weinstein, had no memory of the half-starved young boy that she'd caught eating biscuits out of her dumpster, and his mother's friend Angie and Lisa, who had fallen out with her, were now back in her life, as if they'd never left, for the memory of their fallout had been magically expunged, as if it hadn't happened at all. Or if it did, it was in a parallel reality. The tea parties naturally resumed, and Edward once asked Angie what had happened to Zara Witchen. Angie had looked at him with a puzzled expression on her face. Zara Witchen? What are you talking about, Edward? I'm sorry, I've never heard of her before. I don't know who you're talking about. But remember, your dog Bo went missing. Zara Witchen helped you find his whereabouts. My dog Bo did go missing, Edward, said Angie. You're right about that. But no Zara Witchen helped me. It was the farmer next door who helped me. He told me that Bo had fallen down a hole in his buttercup field, so I went over to his house to collect him. Edward looked at Angie bemused, realizing that everyone had forgotten the events that had led to his mother being possessed by a demon. Even his mother's own dentist had forgotten he'd kicked her out of his surgery. But Edward realized that this was all for the best. When he was 12 years old, he did actually see Zara Witchen. She was visiting one of those mystical stores and was buying tarot cards and some strange-looking tinctures. Zara had walked straight past little Edward, not even giving him a second glance, but he knew exactly who she was and suspected she was still caught up in the world of witchcraft, for she was wearing the same dress she had worn the very day she had visited his mother. Edward realized that the wild man obviously possessed many of those spiritual attributes that a shaman has, but there was no doubt in his mind that the wild man had outer-worldly abilities that had terrified the demon half to death. The wild man had the power to get rid of demons, open up portals into other realms, and wipe memories clean in order to bring about healing. Edward was very, very glad that he never forgot this very memorable event in his young life, for the wild man had told him remembering this would serve him well, so he could teach others not to mess around with things you don't understand. And over the years, that is what Edward has done, preaching in local churches and schools about the extreme dangers of messing around with the occult. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.